Good afternoon. It's nice to see everybody. My name's Andrew Murtha, and I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm delighted to welcome back an old friend, Roselyn Hsueh, to talk about her book and to engage in conversation with two of my colleagues and with all of you. Professor Hsueh is Associate Professor of Political Science at Temple University, and she co-directs there the Certificate in Political Economy. She's the author of the new book, Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China, India, and Russia, that came out earlier this year from Cambridge University Press. Run, don't walk, to buy your copy. And she is also the author of China's Regulatory State, a new strategy for globalization from Cornell University Press, came out in 2011. She's also written a number of scholarly articles and book chapters on states and markets, comparative regulation and governance, and development and globalization. She's also a frequent commentator on international politics, finance and trade, and comparative political development. She's been featured in places in news outlets like BBC World News, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, National Public Radio, The Washington Post, and so on and so on. She's also testified before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission and lived to tell the tale. Consulted for the Center for Strategic and International Studies just across the street. She served as a Global Order Visiting Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, member of the Georgetown Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, and residential research faculty fellow at UC Berkeley, where she got her PhD. She also lectured as visiting professor at Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico, and served as a visiting scholar at the Institute of World Economics and Politics, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She's the recipient of the Fulbright Global Scholar Award and other prestigious fellowships for international fieldwork, and she held the Haywood R. Alker Postdoctoral Fellowship at the University of Southern California. She earned both her BA and her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. But before Rosie accomplished any of these things, except maybe the BA, is when I first got to know her, when she was a graduate student and I was a newly minted assistant professor. And my friendship with her has only grown over the years, and there's been nothing more exciting for someone like me than to see somebody evolve in an intellectual capacity the way she has. She has her feet in a number of areas in the discipline and in various sub-disciplines, and she really is somebody that I think we can all learn from. I'm also very, very delighted to introduce our two speakers who will be commenting on Professor Hsueh's presentation. The first is Professor Devesh Kapoor, who's a Star Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies here at SAIS, and Professor Ling Chen, who's an Assistant Professor of Political Economy. And I also should say that those two faculty members are among my favorite colleagues here at SAIS, so I'm really very, very happy to be part of this, even if I'm just going to be the moderator. As such, let me just finally give you a sense of what the format is. Professor Hsueh will give her presentation, and then she will be followed by first Professor Chen, and then Professor Kapoor, and then we will open up. She will respond to their comments, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. I have a very hard stop at 5 o'clock, so I'm going to have to leave, but there will be time afterwards to chat and continue conversations. So don't, just because I'm not here doesn't mean you can't stay. So with all that out of the way, let me just end here and just say how delighted I am to welcome back my good friend, Roselyn Hsueh.
Thank you so much, Andy, for the very kind introductions. I would love to say that I'm going to claim SAIS as well, and the reason I'm going to do that is because Andy's here, and obviously, as he had mentioned already, he has known me since my graduate school days. I'm also going to claim SAIS because I actually, I'm going to move on. So the first book talk ever for my first book, China's Regulatory State, was actually a SAIS as well. And so in that sense, I've had a long history with Johns Hopkins SAIS, and so it's such a delight to be here. And so thank you very much for having me. And also want to say that there are a couple people here in the audience that I want to make sure I make a shout out to, in addition to Professor Murtha, is Professor Kapoor, who, when he was at the University of Pennsylvania, very much supported my project, my crazy, ambitious project, which I'm still in the process of finding out what the reception will be. As Professor Murtha mentioned, the book just came out in June, and typically for academic works, for those who are academics in the room know, it takes a little bit to find out, what the actual temperature is for the book. So we'll find out in a little bit, but I am grateful that Professor Kapoor was one of the early supporters of the work. Also, I have a former research assistant who's also here in the room, and I acknowledge her in my book. She helped me research the Russia chapters of the book. So it is really nice to be able to claim SAIS in that sense. Okay, so with that much ado, I will do a quick summary of the book. I told Professor Murtha that just stop me at 35 minutes. Many academics can go on, as you probably have learned. So please do stop me. As I mentioned, I am the author of China's Regulatory State, a New Strategy for Globalization. The book was basically the first book to identify the Chinese government's use of regulation to engage in market reform, to engage in China's integration into the global economy. And oftentimes, especially for those of us who are political scientists in the room, and comparative political scientists in the room, when we think about regulation, if you're an Americanist, regulation is state control and state intervention. But if you're a comparative political scientist, regulation is actually seen as lack of or less state control, because oftentimes as comparativists, we think about the developmental state. And we think about the iconic model of the developmental state and how the developmental state is about more state intervention and more state control. And here in the first book, what I do is I identify how, China is actually using regulation to engage in this dual track state building and market building. So on one hand, there are more markets, more competition, but also in parallel, we do see more state building, okay? So in that sense, it's neither less regulation and less state control, but it's also not the developmental state. And it's about what I call in the first book, liberalization two-step. This idea that China opened its macro economy and then in parallel re-regulated it, and particularly at the industrial sector, and many of which is what we're seeing today. In this second book, Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, I demystify the China model, but also Russia and India as well. Similar to China, also opened its macro economy in the early 1990s. And so that's where I'm going to begin the empirical puzzle, and also the theoretical puzzle of this study. And to talk about how that regulation governance model that I wrote about in my first book becomes the micro-institutions of capitalism in China, but that we also see similar in India and Russia across industrial sectors, but done differently? And how do we understand the motivations and the drivers? And what does that have to do with industrial structures, organization of institutions, and really also the history of economic and industrial development? So everyone assumes that there's this model to explain transition economies in the context of global economic transition. And I think the reason that everyone assumes that in the scholarly world, and really also in the empirical world, is because of Russia's transition to in the post-Cold War period, right? As all of you know already, shock therapy, introduction of competition, letting go of communist institutions, and rampant privatization, and the introduction of macro stability and so forth. So there's this idea that that's the way to go. If you are going to have a transition away from socialist institutions, it's about liberal economy. Russia famously did shock therapy. China famously, as existing literature tells us, it was a more gradual approach. Yet, transition away from socialist institutions. They are then also assumed to have national level linear unitary globalization trajectories. And it's unitary and linear because it's the end of history. As Francis Fukuyama famously said, right? It's liberalization. And Big Bang liberalization in India was supposed to go that way as well, right? In the 1990s, the Indian government, introduces competition, and this is macro across the industries, and Nehru-era socialist institutions are going to fade away. What I do in this second book is I extend my previous book, and I explore the analytical utility of going to the industry. And I make the argument that only when you open the macro economy and go to the micro industry level are we then able to see and also to learn about the reality that that transition model, that end of history liberalism or neoliberalism is going to lead to liberalism, not just on the economic dimension, but also political dimension. The conventional wisdom is in fact not true. And in many ways, we are seeing that literally, like, as in parallel to what we're doing today, right? We have the 20th Party Congress going on today. And that idea of, economic liberalization will necessarily lead to political liberalization out the door in many ways. The idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union and transition to democracy and economic liberalization was going to necessarily lead to decentralization, deregulation, also in many ways out the door. And even in the India model, once you go to the micro industry level, that has not necessarily been true. So how do we make sense and understand this pivot away from the conventional wisdom, and yet at the same time pay attention to national level specificities? Because as area specialists, we care about national level specificities. We care about micro level specificities. Context matter. So how do we come up with, and that's the question that was driving my work, how do we come up with a model that is at the same time generalizable, but at the same time allows us to understand context specificity? So that was the task that I gave myself, and was in some ways, maybe we're here from the panelists foolish. We're seeing what happens, but it was definitely ambitious, if nothing else. I compare these countries, or I make the argument that they're comparable, despite context specificities. And I do that because they are large countries of comparable size with federalist systems that have, importantly, existing industrial bases. Because oftentimes, especially for those of us who study the global south, one question is, I don't know if we could compare, Nigeria with China. These are apples and oranges. They don't, we have, there isn't necessarily an existing industrial base. And so if you're comparing a country with no existing industrial base with another one, not comparable. Well, these three countries do have history, they have history of an existing industrial base that are interesting and of which become path dependencies or existing organization of institutions that we need to account for. And so that's why I do bring in the 3 countries. I began with looking at China, then also taking my study to China-India comparisons, and then I brought in Russia as I worked on this book. This I may skip a little bit. I'll just go really quickly. Just I don't know how, but this is just kind of more for the academic folks. There are many within the China field who, not quite sure if China is comparable. It's area studies, and China itself is really big. Why do we need to necessarily compare China to other countries? But we do have existing political scientists, including Lily Tai at MIT, who has made the argument that actually studying China could allow us to look at and understand comparative political development, comparative political behavior, and that many of our political science theories are grounded in research on Europe or on Latin America. Why can't we take China and test existing theories that came out of China and see if it makes sense for other parts of the world? What are the scope conditions? What is generalizable and what is context specificity? And so in that sense, I build onto and extend the work I do in my China-specific work and bring it to looking at testing some of the propositions, generalizable propositions in other contexts. And also, of course, we have other political scientists who have attempted to do that. And so I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge existing literature on people who have done that kind of comparative work. So I've chatted about this already, mentioned the East Asian developmental state model, very iconic. We also have, particularly among the scholars who study the newly industrialized countries in the Cold War era, but also the post-Cold War era, who say that East Asia and Latin America are different because Latin American countries took the neoliberal model, right? And part of that conventional wisdom of the liberal trajectories is that there are countries in the world who have done so. Now, the argument among these comparative political scientists is that, well, East Asia extended more state control, and therefore that was better for development. Latin America took the more neoliberal model, and there was exploitation, there was coalitions even between state and government. And of course, these are generalizations. Of course, there are exceptions, but those are kind of the iconic 2 models. What I argued that, in fact, we see something very different for all these three countries that are integrating into the global economy in the neoliberal era. First of all, in 1980, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, China, India wasn't quite really that open to the outside world. I don't even have data for Russia because it was, under communism, the Soviet Union still. Lo and behold, 15 years later, we see that, in fact, these countries have integrated into the global economy. Indeed, China is a big part of the global economy, India and Russia as well. Okay, this was after Big Bang globalization. This was after the collapse of the Soviet Union and openness to the global economy. FDI is a percentage of GDP. These countries are quite open, and they do differ from the Japan, Taiwan, the United States. And United States, well, it's a more liberal model, but even the United States, as a percentage of GDP, these 3 large emerging powers actually are more open in that sense, at least on this measure of globalization. Let's see, and by 2015, we also still, again, see a quite open picture. Russia is, at least as a percentage of GDP, was lower than India and China. Now, part of it is not so much that Russia wasn't open to FDI at the time. It was also because FDI didn't necessarily rush into Russia. Part of it was by 2015, there was some centralization that was happening. And then also the other conventional wisdom is no regulatory capacity, lack of capacity, industrial capacity, and so less to invest into, right? This is kind of more of a longitudinal view. If we take 1990 as a starting point of openness, then in general we do see most countries opening as if we do a process tracing of openness to FDI. And they do actually, by 2019, do converge. We see ebbs and flows. And some of that has to do with the East Asian financial crisis and then the 2008 global financial crisis. But really, they are still comparable. So this is all to show that they can be comparable. Another measure of globalization or development, and you guys can't see it, it's exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP from 90 to 2019 for all three countries. So there's some comparability there too on exports. What we find is that all three countries, indeed, despite being open in this neoliberal model, they have, once we open the black box of the macroeconomy, they have re-regulated. They have re-regulated just like China has, but in different ways and across different sectors, motivated by a different set of perceived strategic value, is what I argue, with impacts of the industrial sector. And so, indeed, then leading to distinct economic outcomes and development outcomes that may be, again, contradictory to what conventional wisdom is. So conventional wisdom is, unfortunately we can't see, this is science and technology patents. So the conventional wisdom is China outperforms everyone, not just China, not India and Russia, but just every country in the world, developing country in the world, in terms of S&T patents. So conventional wisdom, okay, and at least on SAT patents that appear to be true. Yet once we break it down to the sector, the picture looks differently. So we have Russia ICT, which is essentially value-added services, software, IT services, and so forth. Once we break it down, once we open the macroeconomy, take it to the sector, and not just the sector, but also the subsector, then we actually do see quite varied outcomes. And varied outcomes that may contradict what conventional wisdom might tell us of, Russia economic development or Indian economic development, and or even the prowess of China in terms of being outperforming many countries in the world. And so, what is the relationship between internal development and integration into the global economy in developing countries? The driving question. How and why do state-market relations differ? And do these differences matter in the post-Cold War era of global conflict and cooperation? And so in the last chapter, and really also in the country case chapters, but definitely in the last chapter, I addressed some of recent developments during the pandemic, and then also, of course, Russia's invasion into Ukraine and the ascendance of Xi Jinping and Modi. And so forth. And I address how this study actually have implications, and really I'm able to trace across time why we see some of the developments that we see today. To the point that, to say that some of the developments that we're seeing today since 2012 in China, for example, in my periodization and my tracing to the industrial origins for the sectors that I look at, in fact, would date the centralization politically and economically in China today to having roots prior to Xi Jinping coming into political power. And so happy to address some of these implications of the study to recent developments. So I'm gonna just kind of introduce, we're 15 minutes, okay, perfect. I'm gonna introduce my overall arguments, and then I will kind of give snapshots from the three studies. So I make the argument that market governance structures will mediate globalization and development, and that the strategic value framework of the book allows us to understand why is it that we see that these three countries, even having a similar starting point in recent globalization of liberalizing, have re-regulated, and why they do so in the ways that they have at this industry level. I argue that perceived strategic value of sector interacting with sectoral institutions and structures, and by that I mean technological properties. Telecoms is going to be telecoms, whether you are in India or you are in Russia. There are just going to be sectoral structures that you cannot escape, no matter which country you are. Those sectoral structures will matter. But so does existing organization of institutions. How those sectors are organized and governed to begin with will shape market governance today. And that will interact with how state leaders perceive the strategic value of sectors. And how that perceived strategic value will be a reflection of how state elites respond to internal and external pressures at any given point of time. And what we then see is that the resulting dominant patterns are what I call national configurations of sectoral models. So we have the generalizable aspect of the strategic value framework, which is that we have these national configurations that are based on what's happening at the industry level. Okay? But the actual configuration and what those sectoral models look like, that's where I incorporate in my study the context specificities. Okay? So the power of the strategic value framework is that it allows us to identify the fact that perceived strategic value about industrial sectors will play an important role. And so it's a generalizable theory. But what are those sectors? And what motivates states to think something is valuable or some industry is valuable will be context specific. It will be context specific, and it will also depend on industrial structures and existing organization of institutions. Then let's talk about that context specificity. And so in this quite thick book, which you could, of course, depending on if you're an India specialist or China specialist or Russia specialist, pick up to read the country case chapters. But what I do is I make the argument that based on the strategic value framework, techno-security developmentalism, so the strategic value framework, the independent variable, will shape the market governance model, right? The dependent variable, what I identify as bifurcated capitalism, which centralizes governance of high-tech dual-use sectors. By dual-use, I mean dual-use security sectors, and then decentralize labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. Now, of course, there are going to be complexity within the centralized and the decentralized sectors. We are going to see soft centralization, much of which Professor Murtha has written about. We're going to see fragmentation in both the fragmentation between and interaction between bureaucracies, right? We're going to in both the centralized and the decentralized sectors. But what I say is that these are dominant patterns that we're going to see because of that strategic value framework. In India, I identify, based on, with the strategic value framework, what I call neoliberal self-reliance, which shapes what I call the bifurcated liberalism. All industries in India have been exposed to Big Bang liberalization. But what that liberalism looks like will lead to the centralization and governance of small-scale rural sectors, which in many ways actually contradicts conventional wisdom of in India of what small-scale rural sectors look like. And I'll come back to that in a little bit when I talk about the labor specific, the actual sectors, the empirical data. And we'll decentralize high-tech, globally connected sectors. And a lot of that will be about, the exposure to ideas, the exposure to transnational networks, many of which Professor Kapoor has written about. That idea of, what are some of the ideas that have flowed into India, particularly during the Big Bang liberalization, that have influenced, that have brought in Indian returnees to call for liberalization and decentralization in those sectors. And yet, we still see the continuity or the importance of what I call the nationalist imagination about self-reliance and how driving India's governance of more labor-intensive small-scale sectors. And how do we explain that? And what is that strategic value calculations? I call that the neoliberal self-reliance. And then in Russia, I make the argument that the framework identifies security resource nationalism, which shapes bifurcated oligarchy, which centralizes the governance of infrastructure and resource sectors and decentralizes labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. And again, in all the countries, there are complexity within these dominant patterns, and happy to explain and chat about the complexity, but these are the national configurations of sectoral models. And what I'm going to do is I am going to really quickly just mention the fact that this work is based on field work. It's based on interviews, qualitative interviews with ethnographic sensibilities. It's based on visits to the industry level, to subnational governments, and which actually dovetails with quite well with what Professor Chen has written about subnational variations, and which in my framework we see much of in the decentralized sectors. And so the fieldwork took me to the subnational, to the decentralized sectors, as well as interviewed elites at the central level and in the central level bureaucracies. I also rely on published and unpublished documentary data, descriptive statistics from national governments, business and sector associations, IOs, foreign delegations, and so forth. Okay, so happy to chat more about how I conceptualize market governance. It's about the role of the state in market coordinations, but it's also about the distribution of property rights. And this is true for all three countries. On one hand, there seems to be a lot of state control in certain sectors, but also at the same time, a lot of private industry. So how do we reconcile private industry and state control? And so in this concept of market governance, what I do is I look at both dimensions. And I come up with a typology of market governance, where on one hand we have the role of the state, and then we also have the distribution of property rights. And it's together is how we need to look at this. So how can we have a telecommunications industry that, since China's entry into the WTO, brought in a lot of private property rights, but at the same time regulate business scope, investment level, market entry, and so forth? How do we reconcile that market governance? And how then can we explain why is it that the Chinese government, despite having allowed in lots of competition and market stakeholders, could then in 2020, for example, come in and reorganize the Ant Group, and then of course Alibaba, and these private industry entrepreneurs that have, for the last couple decades, been able to operate. How do we reconcile that? And how can we reconcile that market governance? It's centralized governance that permitted both the central coordination of the central role of the state in market coordination, but at the same time allowed for a diverse distribution of property rights. Common forces of change. I want to acknowledge that there's existing work and debates in all three countries about common forces, right? The open economy politics, the important role of interest groups, subnational characteristics, very important, historical legacies, regime type, the big elephant in the room, which I'm happy to address, and global norms and markets and organizations. Okay, so I only have 5 minutes, and what I'm gonna do is the perceived strategic value. Just wanna say that, if perceived strategic value is so important, what are some of the measures that we're looking at? I am interested in political dimension of perceived strategic value, but I'm also interested in the economic dimension. What does it mean for social political stability and regime legitimacy on the economic, of a particular sector, on the economic dimension? How valuable on the economic dimension is the industrial sector? Do we look at the contribution to the national technology base? Do we look at a sector's contribution to the economic growth and global competitiveness of the industry? And yes, so in looking at and thinking about strategic value, I think about a holistic perspective of economic dimensions is going to matter, and political dimensions will matter. And that will shape the role of the state in goals, government business relations, and then also state methods. There will be an intersubjectivity. There are going to be times when it might be irrational to continue state intervention? How do we explain why there's a central level Ministry of Textiles in India today when during the age of neoliberalism, every country in the world had deregulated textiles and actually dismantled the Ministry of Textiles? And why are we, why do we still see handlooms and power looms that are small scale and highly polluted that the Indian government acknowledges to be highly polluted? Yet on the economic level, they employ a lot of people. On the political level, the small-scale owners contribute to, and the workers contribute to elections. But importantly, the idea of cotton nationalism and textiles contribute to the nationalist imagination of what it means to be Indian, of what it means, what differentiates India, dating back to the time of Gandhi's Swadeshyanism, mobilizing not just the small-scale textile workers, but also large textile mills and large entrepreneurs who, some of those legacy families now own huge companies across multiple sectors, mobilizing both constituencies that seemingly have different industrial interests together for the national project. And that's how we can explain why is it that self-reliance or the imagination of national self-reliance is still quite important to India today. So I just want to show some pictures because we don't have much time. Techno-security developmentalism, China, centralized governance, telecoms, but state-owned infrastructure, but lots of private stakeholders and value added in equipment, but of course, most recently, more intervention on the corporate governance level as well. Textiles, decentralized, lots of FDI, but in some certain subsectors, such as technical textiles, where it is quite important, high security impact, and economically important to subnational governments. You're going to see subnational governments paying more attention to the more high-tech sectors of textiles. And also even the Ministry of Science and Technology granting money to firms that are going to be producing man-made fiber. Famously, all of the spacesuits that took Chinese astronauts to the moon were man-made and made in China. But textiles, the earliest to let go, and lots of private industry. There aren't going to be that much centralized intervention, and in fact, we haven't seen that, even in the Xi Jinping era. Some subnational interventions, subnational level, but really not at the level that we're seeing in the centralized sectors. India, this idea of neoliberal self-reliance, I was able to find a picture of Modi, reenacting that rhetoric, right? That ideology of the importance of cotton nationalism, capturing the imagination. Now, this is not to say that, the textile sector or even the technical textile sector receive tons of state subsidies. But when you peel open the macroeconomy, what we do see is exemptions and in taxes, in subsidy, and also continuing subsidies at alarming levels that are surprising and maybe even sometimes irrational that still occur today because of the importance of small-scale sectors. But there is objectivity to that too. Political elections, and then also the fact that they employ a lot of workers, small-scale workers in the large, within the large India population. Telecoms, one of the most competitive markets in the world is Indian telecoms, to a point where actually FDI is not even that competitive. Too many context specificities for AT&T to figure things out. But there's lots of competition. This is neoliberalism. There's a regulator. And in fact, India, it's not just the services outsourcing that India is a global leader in. Indian telecommunication operators operate with competitiveness in the global south, often competing with China Telecom, China Mobile. These operators that the Chinese government have continued to own. Why? Because they run the infrastructure, the national security infrastructure in China. But when they're out there in the real world, they have to compete with the very highly competitive Indian telecommunications markets. Textiles, you do see a mix of centralization, decentralization, and also fragmentation. This is where the centralized Ministry of Textiles doesn't do quite good of a job. As you know, the state capacity is an issue. Famously, lots of debates in the Indian literature about state capacity. It's all true. But the ministry still exists. The ministry still continues to get, allocations of central funding. And even when liberalization, Modi famously began, tried to institute export-oriented industrialization of the East Asia developmental state model. And yet, within that EOI industrialization set of policies, we see very micro-level methods on retaining and keeping this centralized governance of small-scale industries and the textile sector. I don't think I have that much time. There may be folks who have questions about Russia. I guess I show a picture. Small-scale, very different picture from what we saw of China, right? Large-scale mills with like modern equipment. This is the dominant with power looms and hand looms, and also people, even in clothing and apparel, small-scale sewing factories. This is the dominant picture of textiles in India. Meanwhile, right outside is a very competitive, highly technologically advanced telecoms market. I'll just show pictures of Russia. Contradicting conventional wisdom, Russia, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually did not privatize telecommunications infrastructure. They decentralized it, gave it to the regions that then Putin was able to re-centralize. Putin did not have to buy back. It was just re-centralization because it was never privatized. And I show this picture of Russia, the Russian Federation, because to show you Russell Telecoms, Russia's only backbone infrastructure, which of course landlines who use it anymore, so maybe not so important. But for other types of Wi-Fi infrastructure, and certainly in satellites and so forth, it's still quite important for different, even more technologically advanced sectors to build on top of it. And this is where knowing and understanding the industry and industrial structures matter. Seriously, my last sentence. Was gonna say, picture of textiles. Even before Russia collapsed, during glasnost and perestroika, textiles was the first to be marketized and privatized during the Soviet era. And even though it was the first to let go, it also languished at the subnational regions. And to a point where even though Russia has the largest luxury apparel market in the world, lots of wealthy oligarchs wanting to buy, upscale apparel, but Russia does not produce apparel. It was languished at the decentralized levels. When Crimea happened, when the annexation happened, and when these very light sanctions happened for Russia, it gave the pretext for textile associations that are privatized and decentralized to mobilize the Putin government to start import substitution industrialization policies in the textile sectors. And that's why we see Putin suddenly touring these outdated, integrated textile mills that for decades have been languishing, but now receive some money. Now, what I want to end with is these are the national configurations of sectoral models, but actual development outcomes are going to be much more complicated. Will the ISI policies work in textiles in Russia? Unlikely. We already have global leaders in South Asia. We have global leaders in Turkey, global leaders in China. But in fact, that we are seeing because of state elites' response to internal and external pressures, the evolving strategic value framework, and then leading to these episodic interventions that may or may not be long-lasting. So at that, I will end my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be included here, and I learned really tremendously by reading Professor Hsueh's book. Her fascinating book, and also it's a serious book. It's seriously engaged with the cases of China, Russia, and India. in a comparative way, which means that you do not like reduce the comparative picture to the very end of one chapter, just like I did, but it's a serious comparative book. When I was in my graduate, when I was a graduate student, originally I had ambition of doing my dissertation and slash the first book by comparing China and India. But I stopped doing that because merely the China case has totally bogged me down. It's like, I cannot do India anymore. China is so complicated. Let me just focus on China, right? So think about navigating, well, you're the same. Okay, now you have your second book to have that ambition realized. So think about this. I really admire Professor Hsueh's courage to do that. So this book have given us a picture that are both macro level national comparison, but also not losing the micro level specificities of the sectoral variation. And that is the very strength of the book. And also by doing so, it has bringing, through a comparative picture, it has contribute to essential theoretical lessons and understanding how we understand the interaction of state and market. It's no longer a debate about more state and more market or whatever. That's a very stupid debate, and we already know that everyone agrees and there's always certain degree of state and market involved. So having a sectoral picture and also placing in the background of globalization, I would say is the central contribution of this book. I mean, there are a lot of merits of the book that I wouldn't have time to dwell on. So let me start with some of the possible questions. Sectoral value or the strategic value play a very important role in this book, which led people to ask a question that what exactly determines the strategic value. Of course, there are a lot of things, political, economic, historical, that affects affects the narrative and affects the perception. But we want to ask, affects whose perception, right? Affects whose narrative? Are you talking about mostly the central state leaders, or are there any interaction between the central and the local actors, especially in the India story, right? There's politicians who are trying to seek elections and voters. Whose perception are most important in deciding the value, the strategic value of the sectors? And since I'm more of a China expert than any other cases, I was wondering in terms of China case, for example, in the background of the current U.S.-China tech war, when we talk about strategic value, people would immediately thought about the semiconductor industry, the chips. And it's very tricky, and my students keep asking me, what are the sectors that are most important? Oh, I see some of the students, thanks for coming here, because it's your midterm week, and your midterm exam actually is due on Friday, so thanks very much. Thank you. But, but thanks. Okay, but the thing is, the reason it's tricky is that semiconductor industry is hardware technology, and in an unusual narrative of strategic sector, especially the China has to dominate these strategic sectors. We have like aviation, mining, oil, power grid, and telecommunication. But telecommunication is really referring to the network of telecommunication, like China Mobile, for example. So where should we place the hardware, very high value added hardware tech sector, or are they're somewhere in the middle? Usually when student asked me this question, I said, go to read Professor Hsueh's book and previous articles. She talked about strategic value a lot. But here I really want to put this front and center because I get to ask many times. Another question I want to ask is about the role of politics or, the regime type, as people will easily notice that both China and Russia are quite authoritarian, whereas India is the largest democracy in developing countries. And people are just wondering, is it because of regime type that we saw techno nationalism, right? Is it because of that they do not have to appeal to their constituents, their voters, that they don't worry about small sector, like they don't worry about textile, they don't worry about protecting the labor, protecting the workers, because they don't have to appeal to that group, for example, in China. So how does politics and regime type play into that? And also I found it's fascinating to talk about sectoral variation, but is it true that that the more strategic value a sector has, it implies that certain sectors have to be dominated by state-owned enterprises rather than private enterprise? Or is it true that the more strategic value we have, and then certain sectors have to be centralized rather than decentralized? So in other words, do these two dimensions always go together? I have a sense that in China they largely go together, but I'm not so sure in other contexts. So I think I'll stop here, and I will look forward to defer to Professor Kapoor about India and China and everything else.
And everything else. Thank you. I think it is really a sort of very impressive book to be able to study, 3 large countries and 2 sectors in each. Just the ambition of it itself is sort of breathtaking. And I really sort of admire your perseverance and your endurance in sort of seeing this through. I'm going to just raise sort of a few broad questions so we can have a conversation. I think one of the things which I sort of really liked about the book is that it really forces us to really try and do away with the dichotomies we always have, sort of neoliberal versus the development state, export promotion versus ISI, comparative advantage versus competitive advantage, and so on. I mean, these sort of state versus market is a very 20th century. We are in the 21st century, and it's pretty clear, and really going back to Polanyi, that, these are always going to be together. There's variance across sectors over time, but these are complementary always in all contexts. They are not substitutes except at the very ends. Now, this sort of leads me to one question which I would have liked to see a little more in the book. See, the 3 countries that are part of the study, what really stands out about them is size. The 2 of them are, of course, billion plus, and Russia is the largest country by far by size. And why that matters? Because most, developing countries are way, way smaller, right? They're about 14, 15 countries overall that are above 100 million, which includes these 3. And in fact, the vast majority are below, 50 million. So what that means is that, for instance, someone sort of said about India that India lives across, there are some people in India who are still in the 19th century, and some people in the 20th, and some in the 21st. Large countries, you're going to see much more internal, variance. And large countries in particular have to be able to, they have very much, spatial inequalities, the areas, China also, the difference between the Shanghais and sort of Yunnan can be very, very substantial. So how should we think about scale? I mean, how does that shape or make the argument different for countries that are very large versus the average developing country? And the average or the median developing country is going to be much, much, smaller. Now, why I think this also is interesting, the point you raised about sort of India's, what I call love for the small and the small scale. what is even more paradoxical about India is that a country which has such scale, where the comparative advantage would have been to build on its scale, went exactly the opposite, right? Which is this love like for the small, and I'll come back to that. The third sort of question, which when I was looking at some of your graphs sort of early on is I think that more than we think, the patterns of industrialization and the sectoral, there is an account that we need to understand for these countries and others is the sources of their energy. Now, the reason I sort of say it, if you look at both Russia and India, if you look at Russia exports as a share of GDP, well, more than half of its exports is oil and gas.
Yes.
If you take out oil and gas, actually, exports as a fraction of like GDP is much, much smaller, right? The reverse is true of India, because India is a very heavy importer, right? It imports 85% of its oil, about half of its gas. If you take out its oil sort of imports, then India has, which has a large current account deficit, it has no current account deficit. And the share of imports to GDP drops very, very rapidly. Now, both of these were not true, at least like for long, for China, right? Because it had pretty much self-sufficiency in oil, at least till about 10, 15 years ago. And it's never been as large a part of its international trade in the way it has been. Now, that also shaped your case study of synthetic textiles, because the raw material, which is petrochemicals, China started on that much earlier because it had a much cheaper raw material base. The interesting comparison in textiles between China and India is actually cotton. China and India are the world's by far largest producers of cotton, as a roughly the same sort of amount. I checked, it was about 27 to 28 million bales each. So you would think that that naturally, because you have the raw material advantage, that would be a sector of comparative advantage. And I think in that way, your puzzle for India is even sort of greater, why India did not do better. And actually, it's interesting because for this book I'm working on, this puzzle is actually 100 years ago. In the early 20th century, as you point out, India was one of the world's largest producers of textiles and textile mills, actually. And we know that industrialization, in the West, textiles is always the first sector where you begin, and then you move on to other sectors. And so there was an interesting work done because the country in Asia that first really broke into, competitive textile was, of course, Japan. And Japan was importing the cotton from India, and yet its textile mills were more competitive than India's, and that was pretty evident by about 1910, even though it was a late starter. And that actually work really points to something which is not as much in the book, but I just wanted to, which is the nature of capital-labor relations. Right through the first half of the 20th century, when you look at labor unrest in textiles across the world, India had the highest sort of labor unrest in textile mills, 10 times more than UK and the US. So you already had a very fraught labor capital relationship when the unions were really centered on the textile industry. Whereas Japan has had a much more, or much less fraught sort of relationship between labor and capital, which then affected productivity, efficiency, and so on and so forth. So, so that's a long, long, story. A fourth sort of question, which both of you alluded to, is the role of politics, right? And here is both domestic politics, but also increasingly sort of geopolitics, right? And I think it's very likely that China's how its telecom sector develops is very much part of both domestic and international politics, because the need for the regime to really control that sector, you can't have a great firewall unless you control the sector very centrally. It's just simply not possible. Then I think you had a very nice sort of thing where you build up this story of path dependency. One of the things I'd like to hear from you is, path dependency is much greater in mature sectors than in sunrise sectors. And one of the things, at least in the Indian case, I see is that there's much greater ability of the state to move in sunrise sectors, precisely because there are no entrenched interest groups, because it's a new sector, right? Then two other points, and I'll stop. This is something that you also raised. I have increasingly simply not understood what does the word strategic mean. It's such a capacious term. It's used in so many contexts, and it's one of those chameleon-like terms. Depending on the context, I can call something strategic, right? We know that now, over the last year, for instance, there have been serious issues of food security. Now you see agriculture being declared as a strategic sector. On the one hand, we think it's strategic, it's only high-tech, agriculture is precisely what you want to leave behind, but suddenly when there are food security issues, it becomes strategic. So how should we really think about this? Because often it's a fig leaf for interest. If I want to be protective of something, I say, no, this is really strategic, you can't do it. And so how should we really think about this word, which has... Finally, I think, and this comes more from my work in India, so I'd like to hear about it from Russia and China. We always think of the actors. The actors we always think of course, the politicians, the sort of bureaucrats, industrialists, and labor. One actor we almost never mention is the role of intellectuals. I think that actually in the Indian case, they have played the single biggest role for many decades, way more than others, in being veto players. They are the ones who really were against multinationals. And this is sort of related, but I'll come to it. When we talk of the state, right, we think of the central government. There's some things in your book where you talk of subnational government. If you take this thing about the small, right, in India, the textile sector is centralized, but the garment apparel is not. And the reason that did not scale up is because of labor laws. But labor in India in the constitution is a subnational government subject. And the subnational governments, because of pressures from intellectuals, so basically the sort of, the average size of a large apparel factory in China is 10,000 to 20,000 workers. In India, it's a few hundred, right? Because of pressure not to have these very large plants, because of multitude of labor laws that really increase as the size of the plant grows. No industrialist wants to have a large factory. And that is completely not the central government, completely the state governments. And the state governments, their views have a lot been shaped by the intellectual class. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So great comments all around. Do you want to address them, or should we open up the floor for Q&A?
I am open in whatever way, because we have limitation on time.
Yeah, maybe you can blend in some responses to the questions.
We can talk later on during dinner.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just wait for Lexi to grab the microphone. And as usual, please identify who you are, just so we all know who you are. Z?
Thank you so much. My name is Z, first year PhD student at SAIS. It's very interesting, definitely. And my question has been, first is, can you please, so what I got from you is that 3 different model of developments that China, India, and Russia have are based on their ideology. Similarly, especially in the Indian case, it seems like what you convey is like the sense of founding myth of the modern Indian state. It's based on textile, based on Gandhi, that this is being carried out. I think similar argument could be made with China, maybe similar argument could be made with Russia in terms of Putin's PTSD during the 1990s. But my question is, are there any other aspect that might contribute to have this, contribute to like the 3 different methods in term of idea or non-ideas? Something to think about. For example, you talk about constituencies, like voters and constituencies, like who have the politician leaders have to play to. You see, our India in terms of textile workers, maybe that plays a role in China in terms of SOEs, and in Russia in terms of Putin's oligarchs who control the strategic sectors. Maybe state capacity, that in China there is a strong state capacity of regulating SOEs. In India there have been strong state capacity of regulating like textile industries, and in Russia the strong state capacity focus on regulating whatever the Putin like Putin's confidant has to control, and just like let everything else run free. And what about difference in terms of external environment? Like in China, there's a need of strategic, like concentration on strategic sectors, because there's always the fear of like cutting off from the foreign countries. And as you said in the beginning, what Xi Jinping did not start with Xi Jinping. And there might be some other things, or governance structures or things like that. So my question is ideology the only thing that contributes to the 3 layers of like 3 different paths, or do you think there are other reasons that contribute to that as well?
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rachel. I'm a first year MAIR.
I'm not sure if the mic is on.
Hello?
Yeah.
Kind of in the spirit of your presentation overall, refuting a lot of conventional wisdom. Do you think that, my question is kind of in that spirit, we assume for a long time that globalization is a foregone conclusion, that, like you mentioned, it's been called the end of history. Do you think that decentralization or efforts to decentralize could turn the tide of globalization? Do you think that's even possible? Is there a way in which these these methods of development will actually retract globalization in these 3 nations?
Do we have another question?
Hi, my name is Abby. I'm also a first-year PhD student. I guess my question sort of goes on to expanding almost a comparative work for perhaps future research. So you specifically mentioned how there are some echoes, if you may, between these 3 countries that you're looking at, specifically during sort of the post-1990s, and how they, of course, China and Russia are, had their moments at that period, but India sort of liberalized during that post-991 period. But comparing backwards, if you may, into the 20th century, say like Japan, Korea, I was really curious, because again, the false dichotomy of like you liberalize or you're a state-ran country, it's of course not true. And even in the 20th century, you really see that in other East Asian countries. But now if you look into, I guess, more into the future and say Southeast Asian countries that gained independence in the 40s, so say Indonesia, Philippines, how did they comparatively liberalize and simultaneously with state controls, and of course now the sort of the poster child of growth, Vietnam, and they had the war and so on and so forth. So I guess expanding the comparative picture, and as you mentioned in your very early talk, how can this theory that you created apply to other countries within the region, if you may?
So maybe one more question for this round, and then
Oh, hi, my name is Ivan. First year ML student right now. So my question, thank you for your presentation about this kind of insightful topic. And you compare these three countries, in a sense. And also you talk about these three countries are now the developmental state in the Southeast, the South Korea and Japan. And also they are now the neoliberalism model in the Latin America. Some people, some commenters said there's a Beijing consensus on this kind of model, and there's a lot of critics about the Washington consensus on the other side, talking about the fallacy of the Washington consensus. What's your will? I just want to know what's your comment on this kind of thing. Do you think, these three countries, share a lot of similarities and a lot of differences? Do you still like the Beijing consensus, or another name maybe hold in this kind of developmental model?
thank you. Rosie?
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much to Ling and Devesh as well for your questions and just serious engagement with the book. And I really very much appreciate just your comments and thoughts and the questions. And so I'm just going to kind of randomly skip around, and there were some common themes. So so quickly, I just want to address the Beijing consensus versus Washington consensus, in that I wouldn't call the national configurations of sectoral models the Beijing consensus. And the reason I say that, and in fact, I'm not even quite sure I would call the China model the Beijing consensus. And the reason I say that is because, and it is something I think both Professor Chen and Professor Kapoor pointed out that I do in this book, is that I demystify this idea that there are dichotomies, right? And that, in fact, it's complex interdependence, and that states and markets are not just dichotomies, right? They're not just either or. It's really, if you look at China, once you peel in the macro model, we actually saw that there were sectors that would really very much decentralize, deregulate, and let go. And in fact, what I've always say is that in some of those areas, it's almost like the Wild Wild West. We want more regulation. We want more governance. And that's why we see environmental problems and climate change being a very huge problem in China for China to grapple with today, because maybe of the too much of that going on, or allowing subnational politics to drive some of the issues. What I want to talk about is because both Professor Chen and Professor Kapoor and a couple people pointed out, was the strategic value model, right? How do we define strategic? And I agree with you. It's overused, and to a point where we don't even know what it means anymore, right? At least in popular literature. And so what I try to do with strategic value, which by the way is different from strategic, is that I address this more in chapter 2, which departs also from the first book, in that in the first book I came up with kind of developed the theory, and then was able to build more onto it and extend it once I brought in the cases. In chapter 2 of the Micro-Institutional Foundations, in the second book, I go into some detail of, well, how do we think about and how can we conceptualize strategic value? I talk a little bit about it in the presentation on how we have, definitely economic and political measures that we need to think about. And one set of dimensions that I didn't mention as much about in the presentation is that there are objective and intersubjective understandings. So the objective understanding is, well, what is, how economically important is the sector to the greater economy? How important is it politically for political legitimacy, for political, socio-political stability. And so some of those factors are objective. But then you have the intersubjective, and that's where the role of ideology, the role of ideas, including some intellectual ideas, or ideas of the founding fathers. And so by the way I conceptualize strategic value, I leave it open in terms of for context specificity to come in on whether it's about the ideas of intellectuals, or is it about the founding father narrative or mother narrative, right? But here so that's why there are objective measures to political and economic dimensions, but also the intersubjective. And by intersubjectivity, I want to be attuned to the past dependencies, right, of some existing organizations, of institutions that may have withstood the test of time, across different regimes. And so I think one of the greatest things about comparing the three large countries is that they also have long histories. And so in the book, in the first chapter of each group of country cases and sector cases, I have a chapter where I trace from sectoral origins. So I go to the beginnings of telecoms and the beginning of textiles in all three countries. And this is where I could capture some of the dynamics from the early era. So for the textile sector, the fact that India indeed did have a very robust textile sector for both the mills and the small scale in the beginning of the 20th century. And at that time, there was a lot of, and one of the reasons why Gandhi was able to mobilize both sets of very different constituents, right, the small scale and the entrepreneur, larger scale people, was because you saw the British colonial government dumping textiles from Manchester, right? Which in a different era earlier was a major driver of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, right? Well, they have come of age. They're dumping, through mercantilism, as we all know, in British colonies, the textiles. And that created a situation where Indian textiles was no longer competitive, even in its own context, right, in India. And so that was allowed Gandhi to mobilize very different constituencies. So the strategic value framework look at intersubjectivities, but also objective factors. And then by going to the industrial origins, I'm able to then trace from the very origins of these industries how strategic value ebbs and flowed based on kind of elite responses to internal and external pressures. And I think that then allows me to segue into the question of politics. Like to whom is strategic value important, and how can it be influential? How could it actually shape the governance models or these dominant patterns? So in this book, I interviewed many different stakeholders, across levels of government and industry and government, and also to firms too. And I am careful to say that I'm looking at political and economic elites. So the people who could actually make a difference, or who can actually have influence in politics. And in terms of, what was really interesting for the India case, for example, is that we see these dominant patterns across the national people's, the Congress Party, the National Congress Party, as well as BJP, and then also now to the Modi era. So the patterns actually hold. And that's where tracing across time is really helpful, because I'm seeing that, not only does it, some of the industrial patterns of governance hold across political eras, and despite regime type, we do see these patterns at the industry level. And I'm seeing that I have 1 minute left. And so I think, unfortunately, I may not be able to address all the questions, but these are very, very important questions, and will help me think about kind of articles I'm going to spin out from the book, and then also my next book talk. So thank you very much.
I want to thank our discussants, Professor Kapoor, Professor Chen, and most of all, our guest of honor, Roselyn Hsueh. So can I just get a big round of applause for everybody?